You can smell it before you see it. It's not the smell of glory you find in the history books. It's the scent of stale sweat, cheap tobacco, and the metallic tang of blood drying on a field tunic. It's 1943. You're in a damp dugout somewhere outside of Tunis, or perhaps a concrete bunker in the frozen wasteland of the Don Bend. On the radio, Goebbels is shrieking about the Enziad, the final victory. He's talking about decadent Americans who would rather dance the swing than hold a rifle, and subhuman Soviets who can be cleared out like autumn leaves. But look at the man at the desk. He isn't a master race archetype. He's a tired, middle-aged man named General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, or perhaps Gotthard Heinrichi. He isn't looking at a map of conquest. He's looking at a production ledger. And his hands are shaking because he's just done the math. The war is lost. He writes to his wife, "We are being crushed by a mountain of steel. Welcome to Battle Vault. I'm your host, and today we're burning the hagiographies. This channel doesn't do great man history. We don't care about the polished memoirs written in 1947 by generals trying to save their necks from a hangman's noose. We're going to the primary source, the private diaries and intercepted letters that the Nazi high command never intended for us to see. For 80 years, the myth of the superior German soldier has been sold to us by popular culture. We've been told that if it weren't for Hitler's meddling, the professional general staff would have won. But the data tells a different story. While the public newsreel showed the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable juggernaut, the private correspondence of these men reveals a state of clinical mathematical terror. They knew the decadent West was actually a high-output factory of death, and they knew the rotten structure of the East was actually a fortress of iron. This is the story of the mask of command, the gap between the propaganda of the master race and the private realization that they were being systematically dismantled by a force they chose to despise, but grew to fear. What happened in those secret letters would be suppressed for decades to maintain the clean Wehrmacht myth. Tonight we look at the numbers, we look at the ink, and we look at the fear. If you listen to the Nazi Ministry of Public Enlightenment, the British Tommy was a joke. Goebbels portrayed them as gentlemanly losers, men who cared more about their 4 o'clock tea than their defensive perimeter. Hitler himself famously called them the little people, convinced that after the humiliation at Dunkirk, the British spirit would simply evaporate. But inside the bunkers of the High Command, the tone was shifting from mockery to a cold, creeping respect. This is the recognition gap. While the propaganda machine was busy filming decadent Londoners hiding in the tubes, the men actually facing the British in the North African sand were writing a different script. Take Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox is the poster child for the chivalrous German myth, but his private letters to his wife, Lou, reveal the math of his despair. By 1942, he wasn't fighting gentlemen. He was fighting a logistical nightmare. He wrote about the extraordinary tenacity of the British soldier, noting that they didn't quit when the manual said they should. The British, Rommel privately noted, have a stubbornness that borders on the fanatical. This wasn't just a general being polite. This was a fighter, realizing his manager bosses in Berlin had lied to him. The British weren't weak. They were just getting started. But the real secret fear, it wasn't the British infantryman's Lee Enfield rifle. It was the Royal Navy. In the private diaries of Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and the General Staff, there is a recurring theme of maritime claustrophobia. They knew that for every mile they pushed into the desert, they were being strangled by a silent, unseen hand. The numbers were brutal. By 1941, the British were intercepting and sinking up to 40% of Axis supply ships bound for Africa. The German public was told the Mediterranean was an Axis lake. The German generals, however, were looking at charts of sunken tons and empty fuel drums. They knew that the British paradox, the idea that a nation of shopkeepers could outfight and outproduce a warrior race, wasn't just a possibility. It was a statistical certainty. History loves to talk about the Blitz spirit, but I think we need to talk more about the German despair spirit. These letters show men who realized, far earlier than they ever admitted at Nuremberg, that British grit wasn't a slogan, it was a strategic wall they were currently driving their heads into. If the British were a paradox, the Americans were a fever dream. To the Nazi elite, the United States was a mongrel nation, a chaotic mess of jazz movies and Jewish Bolshevik influence. Hitler famously dismissed American soldiers as gangsters who would crumble the moment they faced a real army. He told his inner circle that the USA was only good at making refrigerators and washing machines. He was right. They were world-class at making refrigerators. And by 1942, the German General Staff realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that a factory designed to churn out 50,000 iceboxes a year could be retooled in 6 months to churn out 50,000 aircraft. This channel does not do hagiography for American exceptionalism, but we do respect industrial violence. The German generals weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a math problem they couldn't solve. When the first American equipment started appearing in North Africa and later Italy, the private correspondence of the Wehrmacht took a dark, analytical turn. "We are being drowned in a sea of motors," wrote one officer in the 14th Panzer Division. The manager generals in Berlin of the Old Boy Network, who had survived by nodding at the Führer's delusions, ignored the logistics. But the fighters on the ground were looking at the standardization ratio. While German engineers were wasting precious hours hand-building over-engineered Tiger tanks that broke down if they looked at a hill the wrong way, the Americans were landing thousands of Shermans. A Sherman wasn't a better tank in a one-on-one duel, but the Americans had a 1-0-2-1 production advantage. The letters home began to mention the standard of living of the American GI with a sense of bitter indignation. German soldiers were scavenging for boots. American prisoners were found with chocolate bars, fresh cigarettes, and most terrifyingly units that had more trucks than the Germans had horses. In the private papers of General Friedrich von Mellenthin, the disdain for the amateur American tactics is there. Yes, but it's buried under a mountain of fear regarding Allied artillery. He noted that American fire was prodigious and unending. They didn't conserve ammo. They deleted grid squares. The system in Berlin protected its own by suppressing these reports. To tell Hitler that the mongrels had better radio coordination and superior logistics was a one-way ticket to a firing squad. So, the generals lied in their reports, but in their diaries they counted the fuel cans. They knew the sleeping giant hadn't just woken up. It had brought a sledgehammer to a knife fight. Kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. That was the promise. That was the institutional West Point equivalent of the German General Staff's arrogance, the belief that the Slavic subhuman was a logistical error waiting to be corrected. In the summer of 1941, the German managers were already picking out their victory parade uniforms for Moscow. But by December, the ink in the private journals changed from blue to a panicked freezing black. This is where the clean Wehrmacht myth truly begins to bleed. While the newsreels showed endless lines of Soviet prisoners, the diaries of men like Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, reveal a terrifying realization as early as August 1941. "The Colossus has been underestimated by us," Halder wrote. "At the start of the war, we reckoned on about 200 enemy divisions. Now we are already counting 360. The recognition gap here wasn't just about tactical skill. It was about the horror of the infinite." German generals raised on the Clausewitzian ideal of the decisive battle realized they were stuck in a war of attrition they were mathematically guaranteed to lose. The private letters from the front don't talk about Lebensraum. They talk about the Siberian reserves. I think there's a specific kind of indignation we should feel here. The German High Command saw their own soldiers freezing to death in summer tunics because the Old Boy Network in Berlin refused to admit the war wouldn't be over by winter. They treated their own men as expendable assets for a headline that never came. Look at the letters from the Stalingrad pocket. They aren't the letters of master race conquerors. They are the screams of men who realized the subhumans were outproducing them, outfighting them, and, most importantly, outdying them. The Soviet Union was losing 10,000 men a day. And yet, the German diaries express, as a paralyzed shock, that the rotten structure was actually made of reinforced concrete. The statistical grounding is gut-wrenching. By 1943, for every German soldier killed, the Soviets were losing 3, but the Soviets had 5 more waiting. The German generals saw this. They saw the Stalin organs, the Katyusha rockets, and the T-34, a tank so effective and simple it made the German Panther look like a fragile clockwork toy. In their reports to Hitler, they spoke of heroic retreats. In their letters home, they spoke of the Ivan, who wouldn't stop coming. They realized that the masters of Europe were being consumed by the very subhumans they had dismissed. The red fog wasn't just a weather condition. It was the realization that they had marched an entire generation into a meat grinder because they were too arrogant to look at a census report. There is a specific kind of cowardice that wears a chest full of medals. By 1944, the recognition gap had become a yawning chasm. This is the era of the great schizophrenia. In the morning, a general would stand before a map in the Wolfschanz, clicking his heels and assuring Hitler that the new miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, or the Me-262 jets, would turn the tide. In the evening, that same general would retreat to his quarters and write a letter to his wife that read like a suicide note. This channel does not do tragic hero arcs for these men. I believe the indignation we feel should be directed at this. The system protected its own by allowing this double life, while the fighter on the front, the 19-year-old grenadier, was being executed by the SS for defeatism because he said the war was lost. The generals were saying the exact same thing in their private journals with total impunity. Everything is being done wrong, wrote General Gotthard Heinrichi in a private letter. But one can say nothing. To speak the truth is to invite the noose. The statistical reality was now a nightmare of logistics. By late 44, the German army was burning horse meat to survive while the Americans were landing 800,000 tons of supplies a month at the port of Cherbourg alone. The generals knew the fuel was gone. They knew the old boy network of the class of 1915 had failed. They were managing a bankruptcy, but they were doing it with other people's lives. The breaking point came when the Allied management style, cold, industrial, and overwhelmingly efficient, proved it wasn't just lucky. It was better. The private notes of men like Alfred Jodl show a sudden sharp realization. The Allies weren't just gangsters with deep pockets. They had developed a tempo of war that the German master race couldn't match. There are documented moments years before the end where high-ranking officers discussed surrender in their private circles. Scholars like SLA, Marshall, and Sir Max Hastings have highlighted this internal collapse. They weren't waiting for a miracle. They were waiting for the inevitable, but they kept the mask of command firmly in place. They sent last-stand orders to boys in the Hitler Youth while they themselves were already planning their post-war memoirs. The final delusion wasn't that they could win. It was the delusion that they could emerge from the ruins with their honor intact by blaming everything on the corporal, Hitler. The letters show they knew the truth all along. They weren't defeated by a stab in the back. They were defeated by their own arrogance, outproduced by mongrels, and outfought by subhumans. The war didn't end with a bang in the bunkers of Berlin. It ended with the scratch of a pen, but not the pens of the men writing those honest, terrified letters in 1943. No, it ended with the pens of those same generals writing their memoirs in 1948. This is the most successful psychological operation in military history. The clean Wehrmacht myth. Once the guns went silent, the managers who had privately admitted defeat years earlier suddenly developed a collective case of amnesia. They traded their secret diaries for a new narrative, one where they were apolitical professionals who were only defeated because Hitler didn't listen to them, or because the barbarian hordes of the East simply had too many bodies to throw at their superior tanks. But we've seen the ink, we've seen the data. This channel does not buy the professionalism excuse. I believe, and the evidence from scholars like Rick Atkinson and Thomas Ricks supports this, that the German High Command wasn't just defeated on the battlefield. They were intellectually bankrupt. They were the old boy network that saw the world through a 19th century lens, while the Allies were fighting a 21st century war of logistics. The recognition gap we've explored today proves that the deadliest weapon of the Second World War wasn't the V-2 rocket or the Tiger tank. It was the delusion of the men in charge. They knew. From the fuel shortages of 41 to the industrial tsunamis of 44, they saw the end coming. They watched the recognition gap close and then crush them. Yet they kept the mask of command on until the very last second, treating the lives of their soldiers as a currency to buy themselves just one more day of status. History remembers the speeches and the newsreels, because that's what the managers wanted us to see. But the truth is buried in the private letters of the fighters who realized, too late, that they were led by men who were more afraid of the truth than they were of the enemy. So, here's my question for you. Which general do you think was the most hypocritical? The one who wrote about honor while planning his surrender, or the one who called the Americans cowards while counting their artillery shells in his sleep? Let me know in the comments. And remember, in the vault of history, the math never lies.